Thank you for joining us for Murfreesboro Storytellers. We're looking at the former Bottoms area of the downtown Murfreesboro. There's a historic planning study that's underway for the development or redevelopment of this area, and we're pleased to look at it from the past, present, and the future. So join us now with our special guest. We're pleased to have as our guest now John Lodell, who is Director of the Rutherford County Archives. John, welcome to the program.
Thank you, Mr. Hood.
Interesting going on in the community, and that has to do with the Bottoms area, which many people who moved into the community probably know very little about. And I want you to give us some history of the Bottoms area from your standpoint. You've done quite a study, I believe, that involved the Bottoms, as well as other parts of the community.
Yes, exactly. The Bottoms was a very important piece of our historic African-American community here in Murfreesboro. Okay. It's an area geographically, right off the square, but after the Civil War, as former enslaved folks were looking for a place to settle for themselves, it became an area for these former slaves, these African Americans, to move into that part of town and to establish some sense of community where they had neighborhoods, houses, as well as some stores, some businesses, and some churches. So the Bottoms became very, very integral to our African American community. Now, over the years, the demographics changed some because of where it's located. You were right by the railroad tracks, right by a lot of industry. Everything from lumber to cotton gin down that area. So a lot of other workers, white workers, moved into the area as well with their families. So by the 1900s, especially the mid-1900s, you have kind of a mixed race scenario down there. I've interviewed and talked to several folks that grew up in the Bottoms, a lot of our older African-American citizens that grew up down the Bottoms, and they said that, they didn't see a lot of race down there. Growing up, they didn't see race down there because the people that lived in the Bottoms tended to be under the same issues of living, just trying to make a living. The Bottoms was an area that flooded a lot. It was undesirable land. That's why a lot of people got to move in there for, no rent, low rent, very, very cheap housing. There was very little electricity. I was about to say no, it was very little electricity. I interviewed one guy. He mentioned that he and his family, he was born sometime in the 30s, and he remembered growing up there in the 40s, and he said that they lived in a shack. And this gentleman was white, and he said that they had two rooms, kind of a living room, so to speak, where they did not just a living room, as you and I would say, but a living room where they took care of everything from eating meals to socializing, and then another room that tended to be the bedroom that everybody slept in. He said I asked him what about electricity in the house. He said, yeah, we had a light bulb. Oh, okay. And that was the electricity. He said it hung down, a light bulb that hung down in the living room, and that was the electricity. And I asked him about running water, and he said no, they didn't have running water. Most people had outhouses still, even into the 1950s had outhouses down there. And they tended to get the water from the fire hydrant at the end of the street. So everybody shared the fire hydrant for running water. So, you can imagine an area with shacks, shanties. I hate to use those terms, but that's the best way to describe it.
That's very true.
A lot of impoverished people. I interviewed another gentleman, the late Aaron Wade Sr., who did not grow up there but knew a lot about the area. And he said, these were good folks. These were good folks down there that just had a rough life. Right. And they were doing the best they could with what was available. And Miss Gracie Turner would be one to talk about all the social services. A lot of people came down there to help, especially when the floods came, which was very, very frequently. If we had 2 inches of rain, it would flood down there. Yeah. And so, a lot of people would come out of their way to help move people, move furniture, help people out the best they could.
Yeah, I remember a lot of the houses were built on stilts.
A lot of the houses were raised up, try to survive
I call them stilts, but raised up above the ground level.
Exactly.
You have any idea what the population may have been in the Bottoms area, as we call it?
Oh, wow. I wasn't ready for that question. I don't have
that's okay. I didn't know whether anybody has any estimates.
I don't have the exact statistics. I could get close, but I can't. I'm not sure.
When did the transition start in clearing out the Bottoms and the redevelopment for this part of the city?
Well, a trend across the nation in the 1950s was urban renewal.
Yes.
We've heard about it. We've studied it in our history classes. With urban renewal, there was all of a sudden federal dollars coming after World War II. federal dollars used to clean up cities and towns across America. And for a lot of places like Murfreesboro, what that meant was getting close to the root of government, the downtown central area, and cleaning up the areas right around that. And unfortunately, a lot of times that was historical African-American communities that were still under these conditions. And so the idea was, at the time, was to move these folks out of these shacks and shanties with no running water and very limited electricity into new housing developments, what we would later term project housing. But if you think about project housing back then, you had brand new facilities that were brick, that were central heat and air or some type of air systems, as well as running water and electricity. So it really was a modern upgrade from the shacks that were, a lot of these were built in the 1800s still, that they were living in or trying to live in. So that was a major upgrade. At least the city fathers and government officials saw that as an upgrade, and I think to some extent it was.
I think it was.
I think it was. You did see a lot of people, you have two sides of the coin there. So a lot of generations had grown up in this area and they were tied to that landscape, but at the same time this was a chance to get out of that blight and into a more modern facility for housing. So a lot of people, most people were moved out.
Out of that came what is now the Murfreesboro Housing Authority.
Exactly.
And I remember developments on Franklin Road, and that's about to be demolished, I believe.
Franklin Heights.
Franklin Heights for a fire and police training facility.
Exactly.
Also a development on Mercury Boulevard, and another, I guess, up on the North Academy area.
Exactly.
Behind the Oakland's mansion.
Exactly.
There. And still existing today, and still been very well maintained.
Yes.
And provide still housing for a lot of people.
And that's the history right there. We got people out of the bottoms and into those other better housing situations in the 1950s into the 1960s. So what came of the bottoms was the Broad Street Project, as they called it. So Broad Street was a new, I was going to say 4-lane, but if you count the turn lane, 5-6 lane, right through town, right off the square, to bring to help people transition through town quicker and easier, which we appreciate today.
Because prior to that, Highway 41 ran right downtown Murfreesboro, right off the square, and wound around from College Street and down East Main and out Manny Avenue.
Exactly. You had to go through downtown on a 2-lane road.
That's right.
And so all of a sudden you have a 6-lane road through the middle of town, and that's urban development right there.
Really was,
and it brought in all the hotels, the motels, gas stations, and shopping centers before we moved out to the interstate. So that was major development for a place like Murfreesboro. And there again, to some extent, unfortunately, right through that historic African American or bottoms community. And so that's kind of the transition of history there.
This is typical of many communities around the country, I guess, at that particular time in our history.
Exactly. You're going to see that a lot through, Nashville, Chattanooga, Memphis. You're going to see it in most major towns, especially through the southeast. And then what we saw is the Bottoms Project, and then a decade later is the actual interstate projects that cut through major downtowns. Not that it came through Murfreesboro. The interstate didn't come through downtown Murfreesboro, but in Nashville, Memphis, Chattanooga, you see it going through major towns.
And these people, many of the people living in the Bottoms area worked for the railroads, the cotton gins, the mills.
These were industrial laborers. So, they're living right by work, close to it. And so living and working right there in that community. But you got to remember the other aspects of community. With the churches, the businesses, and the schools. For African Americans, predominantly, you had Bradley Academy right there, which still exists as the city-run museum now. And for white children, they would have gone up to Critchlow and Central High School.
What do you think about the Bottoms Project as it progresses now? This should really change the area. Over a long period of time, I presume.
I think it's good for the city. The county is growing astronomically, and of course the cities are also, Murfreesboro, Smyrna, Eagleville, et cetera. For Murfreesboro itself, we're right here downtown. I think it's another way to bring more vibrance back to downtown. As a historian, we talk about, in history, we talk about how Broad Street changed town. We also talk about how the interstate takes commerce away from the historic square and sends it out to the interstate with the avenue and Stones River Mall and those kind of projects. I think the revitalization of the Bottoms area and the Bottoms community brings people back. It's in one essence, we're repeating history. We're redoing it again. But it gives us a chance, if we can see the residential and commercial mix coming into the Bottoms, that we're going to bring people back in where We haven't had people living in the bottoms since 1950s.
I guess that's right.
And we're going to repeat history in a fun way. We're going to bring people living back into downtown area like never before, and or since a while. And it's going to be new and fresh and exciting with that beautiful mix of history and our history and our culture.
And the housing that will be probably included will be multifamily housing. Is that what we're talking about? Condos, apartments, that type of living,
That's
as
what
opposed
I
to
hear.
individual homes.
Exactly. That's what I hear. More mixed use, commercial, industrial, commercial and residential.
Well, it's an interesting project that's underway in the community. How else do you see this community changing it from your standpoint?
Well, that's a big part of there's so much development in the county and so many new folks coming in. So this is going to be a great way to keep, our history, our arts, our heritage, and our culture tied to our historic downtown. We have one of only 6 historic courthouses built before the Civil War still standing in the state of Tennessee. There's 95 counties and only 6 county courthouses built before the Civil War.
I didn't realize
So,
that.
and then all the history of the square right there around the courthouse. So to bring all this new, renewed energy to downtown right off our historic square is going to be a great way to bring folks in, some of our current residents and new residents, and to remind them why Murfreesboro is so great.
And Main Street has done a great job in revitalizing the downtown area.
Exactly. And they're still there to help us. They're again keeping a mind on our historic preservation issues, keeping our roots and our history and our heritage there, while bringing in new development and opportunities.
And there is an inclination for more people to live in the downtown area, not just the Bottoms area, but other parts of the city. Isn't that right?
Yeah, I think you see a lot of the older houses between, say, the Square and MTSU going around Oakland's being revitalized now. So there's a lot of interest in moving in. I'm not going to say like East Nashville, but maybe similar to East Nashville.
Similar to.
Where we see a lot of revitalization in our historic structures with some new development to go along with that.
John, we thank you for coming and being with us and giving us another look at the development of the Bottoms area and what the future holds.
Well, thank you for having me.
We're pleased to have as our guest John Lodell, who is Director of the Rutherford County Archives. And we're pleased to have as our guest now a former resident of the Bottoms area and a lifelong resident of Rutherford County. And that's a longtime friend, a personal friend, that's Gracie Turner. Gracie, welcome to Murfreesboro Storyteller.
Thank you.
Tell me about your recollections of growing up in the Bottoms area. How long did you live there?
From the time I was in the 1st grade at Bradley School,
Okay.
and we moved from there. I think I was about 12 years old.
Okay. Reflect upon when you were living there as just a young child. Were there many families living in the Bottoms area?
Yes, quite a few.
And one of my longest recollections is whenever we had a heavy rain and Town Creek or Lytle Creek would flood, then the Bottoms area would flood.
The water would come down the hill like this was a Warner Street, and would come down, and it had a ditch. We didn't call it no hole. It was a ditch where the water would rise, and that's when my father knew that we had to move and leave. We would go to our granny's house, and she was on the corner of Front and Vine Street.
Okay.
And the water didn't rise there. That's right there where they were free to hide in the water. And that's when my father knew that we had to move out when that water started rising.
And when that would fill up, then it would rise and flood the houses.
Come over in the yard and everywhere.
Now, I have a recollection of a lot of the houses being built on stilts. Was that because of the flooding?
Well, mostly what we call our steps.
Steps, I'm sorry.
Our steps,
Okay.
The steps that we had to come up to go across the water. So then we had to move. Because if you go straight up Church Street, the water would, it wasn't as high, but right in the bottom is when it started rising.
Okay.
And Daddy knew we had to move out.
Where would that have been in relation to where the city hall is now? Somewhere in would that be the deepest part?
No.
Harder. Okay.
The deepest part would be right at the corner of State and Walnut Street.
At the corner of State and Walnut.
Street.
Okay. All right.
Walnut Street.
That's
That
where
was the lowest part,
Okay.
because we could tell. And my grandmother, she lived on Vine Street, and the lowest part was Vine Street and then Front Street, but it didn't rise there. And that's why we would always have to move out and go with her home. But before moving out, our father would always stack our furniture. See, he worked at a lumber yard down there, I always called the bottom industrial place.
Okay.
But they had meals and grocery stores.
What's your fondest recollection of growing up and living all your life in Murfreesboro?
Well, I would say we had a good raising and it was fun. Our mother and father, they joined in with us to play the games that we had.
Mm-hmm.
Just really games, horseshoe pitching and bicycle riding. And it was love and unity in the bottom. If one had a garden, they all would come together and ask for whatever they had in their garden, and it was shared.
Wonderful.
And it really was. And we had neighbors. And we loved the grocery stores because our pennies would buy the suckers and the big cookies that we wanted all the time.
Mm-hmm.
And sometimes they give you an extra one because you did. And on the corner, it was a meal. They would bring the corn there on the cob, and they would fix the meal. And we stayed right in the middle of the block from that meal.
Okay.
And when we see the wagons come, we stand on the sidewalk watching them go in with the sacks, and they come out with the meal.
Okay.
And that was very interesting to us.
I bet.
And there was one lady on the corner across there, she dressed hair. Everybody in the bottom shared and knew the neighbors and showed love and were churchgoers. Our church was on the hill right there on State Street.
Okay.
And the water would come to Church Street and then go across. But our hill, our church, it was named Mount Zion Primitive Baptist Church. And behind that one, on Sevier, Sevier come all the way from the graveyard down to Church Street. And they was right behind. We had a rock fence to separate the yards.
Mm-hmm.
So we would church with them too, backwards and forwards.
When you say cemetery, that's like the city cemetery that's still there on Vine Street, right?
Yes.
Mm-hmm.
So we had a wonderful time, and the bottom showed love and community together.
Well, it wasn't just a bunch of houses located here. It was a true community, wasn't it?
Right.
Uh-huh.
I think so.
That's wonderful. Well, we appreciate you giving us your recollections of living in the Bottoms area and growing
Yeah.
up in Murfreesboro and living here all your life and raising your family. Very much.
And another thing we liked, the hydrants. Everybody had 2 buckets in the kitchen. You always had to have them filled up before you go to bed at night.
I bet, yeah.
So the children that was there. So I love that.
So you had a community hydrant, you got the water.
Yeah, right on the corner.
Okay.
And that was for everybody to use.
Okay. Very good. Well, thank you for reminiscing with me
Oh, yes.
about your growing up in the Bottoms area. We're delighted to have had Gracie Turner, a lifelong resident of Murfreesboro and a former resident growing up in our young years in the Bottoms area. As we continue our program on the Bottoms study, we are pleased to have as our guest Donald Anthony, who is principal planner with the Murfreesboro City Planning Department. And we're talking about the historic Bottoms planning study, right, Donald?
That's correct.
How long have you been with the Murfreesboro City Planning Department?
I have been with the city almost 2 years now.
Okay. And your background coming to this job?
My background, I have a master's degree in city and regional planning from the University of Memphis.
Okay.
So I worked in economic development in Memphis for about a year. Then I went to Conway, Arkansas. And then I came back home to Tennessee and went to Franklin before coming here to Murfreesboro.
Okay. Well, welcome to the community.
Thank you very much.
Well, this is an interesting study about the bottom. What brought this about?
I think over time there's been a lot of interest in the Bottoms. We've seen the area, the livelihood there has sort of gone down over the years. We don't see as many people out. We see more shuttered buildings and businesses. And I think that we've had some folks come in and inquire in our department about what can be done there. And so we wanted to take a comprehensive look at it, looking at the land uses, the economic situation, connectivity with downtown, some other issues. So that prompted the study. Also, Town Creek, which is currently an underground creek, there is definitely some movement toward daylighting that creek, and that runs through the Bottoms, so it plays a significant part in this as well.
By daylighting, you mean opening it up?
Correct. Right now, it is an underground stream, and it runs from Murfree Spring, which is down at the Discovery Center, all the way up through the Bottoms along Hickerson Drive. And so the city is very interested in opening that up, daylighting it, bringing it back up where people can see it, use it as an amenity.
As a matter of fact, we're originating in the council chambers of the Murfreesboro City Hall. We're right in the middle of the former Bottoms area, are we not?
We definitely are. Unfortunately, Highway 41, which we know as Broad Street, was when it was built in the middle of the century, cut right through that neighborhood.
Yeah, correct. It really did. As I recall, growing up in Murfreesboro, the main thing I remembered about the Bottoms was that it was always flooding, and I guess that came about from Town Creek.
It did. Town Creek, Lytle Creek,
Lytle Creek
both
too, yeah.
definitely had flooding issues. And so when the houses were raised there and then the highway was constructed, that was largely in response to the flooding issue.
Mm-hmm. Will opening it up or daylighting it, will that not create some of the same problems, or will prevent them?
I think we'd be able to better manage it now than at times in the past.
All right. Where is the study now as we talk?
The study process has taken about a year. We finally were able to take a draft document to the Planning Commission last week.
Okay.
The Planning Commission approved the study and the recommendations contained within it. So from here on out, that study will be the guide for the Planning Commission for future development and redevelopment of the Bottoms area. We would now also like to take it to the City Council and have them review it, and for lack of a better phrase, give it their blessing as well.
Sure. Explain what you did to come up with the report of the study itself. What different exercises, I guess I would call them, took place in the last year?
Sure. We worked, first of all, with a consultant, Reagan Smith Associates out of Nashville. They now have a Murfreesboro office, so we're very happy to have them here. We worked with them to conduct a series of public events. First, we put together a steering committee, and that was a list recommended by the mayor and city council of people who would help guide this process along. That steering committee met 6 times over the course of a year to provide guidance and input as this process played itself out.
Without asking you to name the members of the committee, give me an idea of the constitution of the committee.
Sure. People who are definitely very invested in the community. We had folks, business owners from the Bottoms. We had Main Street representation. We had Planning Commission, City Council representation as well.
Go ahead, I interrupted you.
Oh, that's okay. That's okay. We did have 3 public events, a workshop and then 2 open houses where we invited the public to come and review the plan as it was taking shape along the way and offer their ideas, their concerns, their input, and a lot of that made it into the final document.
What was the turnout when you had the public meetings?
It was terrific.
Oh, wonderful.
It was way better than I would have ever expected. At our initial workshop, where we invited the public, we had well over 100 attendees. At the subsequent open houses, we had 50 to 60 attendees at both of those. So considering that right now in our study area of the Bottoms, there are no permanent residents of that area, to have over 200 people show up for public events, I think is outstanding.
Because everything in it is commercial or is business location.
That's correct. That's correct. There is a homeless shelter there, but that is definitely dealing with more of a transient as opposed to a permanent population.
What were some of the questions that people had, concerns they had about what this would involve?
I think first and foremost was, how will this study affect my property?
Okay.
And that was for the property owners and business owners there. And then other questions and concerns were about transportation and about getting across Broad Street. We heard that an awful lot.
I can imagine.
Yeah.
Is there any proposal on how you would cross Broad Street? Would there be some overpasses or something like that?
Definitely.
Walkways?
The plan that is now complete does show an overpass, a pedestrian overpass over Broad Street. However, you have to keep in mind that our study area stretches from Old Fort Parkway almost down to Mercury. So we're dealing with about almost a mile of frontage. If you can imagine someone parking on one side of Broad Street and wanting to get to the other side, walking a really long distance just to get to the overpass and then coming back, that could be pretty complicated. So in addition to that overpass, which could serve as a great gateway feature, welcome to Murfreesboro, we think that some at-grade crossings on Broad would be warranted as well. That's a little more complicated because we're dealing with a 7-lane road. So how to do that is definitely a question that our traffic engineer and some of the other folks in the city have to start looking at.
Roughly how many property owners would be involved in this mile-long area you mentioned? Have any idea?
Oh gosh, we have a parcel count, and I want to say that there are a couple hundred parcels in the entire study area.
Okay. So the response, the public response was mainly property owners and not residents, since there are actually no residents, no permanent residents within the area. Right?
Property owners and people who are interested in the bottoms from elsewhere in the community. We did have a lot of interest from outside the bottoms as well. I think a lot of people drive by this area every single day and look at it and think of the potential that it could have.
I can imagine.
Yeah.
And so many new residents probably have no idea of it being the so-called bottoms area and the history of it.
That's correct. I think a lot of people don't realize that this was once a very lively area with a population. It had houses, it had people, it had active businesses, and a lot of going back and forth.
Do you have any idea of what the population might have been, the number of residences? Anybody have any idea on that?
I've seen some figures, but I can't really attest to them. I know that there were rows of houses there, so there were quite a few people.
Tell us more about your recommendation now to and through the Planning Commission, eventually getting to the council.
Sure. So we have a study that includes some recommendations. First of all, there's an implementation stage, and we have to determine how to go about implementing a study. One of those is, do we want to look at zoning as a possible implementation method? Other things, there's the economic component of it. How do we actually draw people into this area? What kind of incentives can we offer for businesses to open here, for developers to construct housing here? There's a lot to it.
You do anticipate that housing would be included in the redevelopment?
Definitely, definitely. There is a large area within the bottom study that is designated as mixed use. Okay. And then there's also more of a suburban transitional type area. Both of those, I would anticipate having some type of housing, most likely fairly high density housing.
Can you physically locate those for me? What parts of the bottoms area?
Sure. The mixed use area is centered around the Old Salem and Castle intersection. So if you can imagine a node there that stretches out for a couple of blocks, and if you can imagine this lively area where you might have retail businesses on a bottom floor and then residents on a second and third floor above.
Okay. I meant to ask you earlier, I believe there's some excavation going on close to the Broad and South Church Street intersection. Is that part of the program of the study?
That is the first phase of daylighting Town Creek, I do believe.
All right. And how long will that take?
That, I'm not quite sure. We can definitely check with engineering on it, though.
Okay. Can you give us an idea of how long this implementation would take for the project? Difficult, I imagine.
It is very difficult because what's been laid out in this document is a vision. Mm-hmm. That doesn't mean that everything that's been laid out there is going to happen. Sure. You know, economics rule the day a lot of times when it comes to development. And so we don't know what's going to happen with the housing market. We don't know what's going to happen with businesses and so forth and where they're going to want to go. But I would say easily within 5 to 10 years, we should start to see some difference in the bottoms if we do our job, and that is to draw people there, get people to invest there, and get people to live there.
I was going to ask you the timetable, so what you're saying is 5 to 10 years as far as the implementation?
I think so. I think to start seeing some difference in the bottoms, let's give it 5 to 10 years. Okay. But I think ultimately, it's a very long-range vision.
I see. What would be the next step?
The next step for us in the planning department is definitely to start looking at zoning. So right now we have zoning in place. There's a lot of industrial zoning and commercial zoning there, as you can imagine. I think that that base zoning that regulates use is probably going to stay intact. We may suggest some minor changes. But we do want to look at a design overlay as a possibility in the future to regulate the form and how things look and how they relate to the street. And to promote walkability within the bottoms.
Well, thank you very much. This is an interesting project and will take a long period of time to really fully be implemented, I presume, but it is a major change suggested for this part of the city of Murfreesboro.
It definitely is.
Thank you for being with us. This has been Donald Anthony, who is Principal Planner for the City Planning Commission for the City of Murfreesboro.